Hello everyone, welcome to tonight's meeting of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. I'm Tobias, this is Will, we're your hosts this evening, and together we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you.
As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you're all now members, provided you adhere to our philosophy. Ex Curiositas Scientia. We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more. Curiosity Club is made merrier by our fellow artisans at Fort George Brewery in Astoria, Oregon. And let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to Jack Harris.
Hi there.
Hello, Jack.
Hi. Oh, you're welcome. I love beer. Let's get back to the beginning of this here. I'm sorry you have to stare at me for a few seconds. So welcome everybody. My name's Jack Harris. I am a co-owner of the Fort George Brewery and Public House in Astoria. I don't know if anyone's ever made it out there. It's going to go a lot better. So just a brief history of my brewing experience in my beer world stuff. Well, even more than that, I grew up in Sandy, Oregon. I went to school at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, and after I graduated, I got hired after a brief stint with Osberg by the McMenamins. And my alma mater, I call it my alma mater, is the Raleigh Hills Pub. But then I graduated, I kind of inherited the job at the Cornelius Pass Roadhouse Brewing. And then from there, I worked a couple of years for the McMenamin brothers, and then I moved to Colorado and worked in Colorado for about 3 years at Mountain Sun. I helped start the Mountain Sun Brew Pub, and then in Boulder. Then I moved back to Oregon and spent a year in Central Oregon before I moved to, I took the job when they tore down the old Bill's Tavern and rebuilt it as a brew pub. I was the first brewer there, and I brewed there for 9 years. And then, but I always lived in Astoria, and so my business partner and I, we decided Astoria needed another brew pub, and so about 8 or 9 years ago, we started that. In fact, we're having our 8th birthday. Tomorrow is our 8th birthday at Fort George. So that's kind of my history. So the title of this talk is "This Beer Doesn't Taste Like IBUs," and I'll make sure. And I didn't come up with that. I don't know, Tobias, did you come up with that? Somebody came up with that. I don't know if it was one of the guys that I work with came up with it. My idea for the name of the talk was "Two IBUs Walk Into a Bar," but what is the problem I have with IBUs is I always look at beer as kind of from the point of view of the person who's buying the beer. And I don't like to call them consumers. I think that's too vague. That's why none of my people, the representatives we have selling our beer, are allowed to call our beer product. They call it product, they get a negative star on their chart because it's not product, it's beer. I think beer is really special. And I don't call the people that drink beer consumers. It grates on me. But I'm always kind of looking after their side of things. And IBUs it's international bittering units, and it's a number that theoretically indicates how hoppy a beer is going to be. And looking at this from the point of view of somebody buying a beer, it's supposed to be an indication of what they're buying. And what my whole point here is that it doesn't do a very good job. In fact, it misleads people, which you'll see by the end of this. So on your average brew pub or tap room, you will see a board very similar to this. And they give you usually 4 pieces of information. They give you the name of the beer, the style of the beer, the alcohol in the beer, and the IBUs. That's generally all you'll see. This is very common. I was at a brew pub today, and just a few blocks from here, and they had the exact same thing going on. And so I just don't see what that does to, the name of the beer, that's great, so you can order it. The style of the beer gives you a pretty good indication of what you're ordering. Alcohol percentage is pretty important because you want to know how many you can have if you're going to drive home or mow the lawn or be a parent. And but IBUs, what number? What is that? What are they telling you? It's some sort of what it tastes like. I don't know why they do that. So that's kind of my question. So where it started as a very specific industrial metric for measuring the bitterness in beer. So they identified what makes beer bitter from hops, and it's mostly used for really large industrial breweries that have places like in Fort Collins and Tampa Bay and across the world, and they want to make the same beer the same way and come out the same way every time. They do a great job at that, and that's how they do that. They use IBUs to measure that bitterness, and that's perfectly reasonable. Hop farmers, they also use IBUs to measure how much bitterness is involved in any kind of beer. My guess is this all kind of started in some super geeky homebrew forum online where these guys were just trying to out-geek each other, and they found this number and they figured out a way to apply it to their homebrews, and it came about. More cynically, it was probably invented by a very cynical or a very ingenious marketer who decided they could put a number on their hoppy beer and out-hop everybody. I don't know, but I first started noticing it brewing really at Bill's Tavern. So around 2000 in the early aughts, people started coming to the bar and saying things like, how many IBUs are in your pale ale? And my wife won't drink anything over 40 IBUs. It's like, what are you talking about? I mean, I knew what IBUs were, but how are these people talking about it? It was very odd. But in the last 10 years, it's, like I say, it's become almost mandatory to broadcast this stuff. And beer festivals, this is, you can't really see this too well, and that's why we highlighted the how much area they give to the sheet here on signing your beers up for a beer festival. I've had beer festival organizers call me, because usually I put NA in that spot, NA, no matter what we're sending. And because we do not post IBUs. We don't talk about IBUs at Fort George. And she just says, give me a number. I'm like, but just give me a number. So I always use 69, except the one occasion I didn't do that was the Fruit Beer Festival was having he wanted an IBU. And so we were making, and it was very convenient because we were making our strawberry rhubarb beer, which we call pie beer. So of course it's 3.14. So, yeah, I don't pay a lot of respect to that number. So, and in fact, there was an IBU's arms race, and it's kind of mellowed out a little bit, but 5 years or so ago, there's all these breweries trying to out-IBU each other, like 80 IBUs, 100 IBUs, 120 IBUs, how much can you put in there? Which is really kind of what I love about the industry I'm in, the craft brewing industry, is you are allowed to go off on these tangents. If you want to make a beer that has 1 million IBUs, or you want to have a brewery, we're going to have a brewery that only uses Brettanomyces. We're going to have a brewery that only brews super obscure farmhouse ales from Belgium. This is where you get your peach pumpkin ales, is because of the ingeniousness of these brewers, and I think that's great. But for some reason, the IBUs have gotten out of hand. So why IBUs? Why have we been stuck with that as a metric for describing the flavor in a beer? And there's another 3-lettered acronym that explains it all, and that's IPAs. This is sort of a sales chart here. This is probably the only real chart I've got tonight that's meaningful. But we've got IPAs and pale ales. They make up almost 40% of all the beer sold. All others, these are specialty beers, and I'll guarantee you that in this category, because they're not permanent year-round beers, that most of those are IPAs as well. Specialty seasonal IPAs. So a vast majority of the beer being sold right now are very hop-forward, hop-centric beers. And so that's why the IBU sort of comes into play. So this is where I'm going to back up a little bit. I don't know how much you guys know about making beer or anything like that. So I'm just going to back up a little bit and talk about why hops. Why are hops even in beer? If you ferment out a malted, a sugar substance out of malt, if you were just to ferment that out without any sort of balance, it doesn't taste very good. The human palate really wants a balance. It wants something to counter that sweetness. And for a long time, for thousands and thousands of years, they would infuse all sorts of different herbs into beer to give you that balance. So things like dandelion and spruce and juniper and nettles were all used. There's thousands of different things. And they would use it for medicinal purposes and all these different things. Well, about 500 years ago, they kind of changed everything and it was happened pretty quickly in the long-term span of beer. But about 500 years ago, hops were in beer. Hops are what was in beer. And the reason a lot of people say this because the German purity laws came in. And I don't know if you're familiar with those, but the German purity laws, they were getting upset with all the stuff being put in beer. So they made a rule that only barley, hops, and water can be put into beer. And that's how the rule reads. And a lot of people claim to follow that today, but they forgot the yeast. They didn't know about the yeast back then. But they fixed that. There's a conspiracy theory behind this, though, that it was actually sort of the feuding between the Protestant and the Catholic churches at that time that caused this break. Because up to that point, the Catholics were famous for brewing these gruits that had yarrow and mugwort and heather and all these kind of psychotropic and frankly aphrodisiacal kind of elements to them that the Protestants saw as another example of Catholic indulgence. And so they promoted putting hops into beer because hops are a sedative and they didn't keep you up partying all night, but I digress. That's another talk. You guys can bring me back for it. So we're back to the hops. So hops, they're cones, they grow on vines, and they are used in the brewing process. So I step back one more time and just sort of explain where they're used in the brewing process. So the biggest job for a brewer is to convert and extract as efficiently as possible all the sugar they can out of grain. That's basically it. It's mostly barley. Sometimes we use a little wheat. Sometimes we use a little oats. Sometimes a little corn, but it's mostly barley. That is a really expensive raw ingredient that's mostly what brewers are paid to do, is to be efficient at doing that. What they end up with is a kettle full of sugar water that they've extracted out of that grain. And it's called wort. And they bring it to a boil, and that's where they add the hops. So you add hops all throughout the boil. You boil for like an hour and a half, and then you'll ferment that, cool it down, then ferment it, and then you'll add more hops for aromatics, and that's called dry hopping. Any hops that are added afterwards, after it's fermented, is dry hopping. So, we have a picture of a kettle here of some hops being added to it. So yeah, that's that's just at the boil. So there's dumping these hops in there, and they boil. Okay. So that's kind of the process where we use hops. So what we're looking for here in the hop, we cut one open here. These are the lupulin glands, and you can see these are the essential oils where they grow the essential oils, and these have what they've identified as the humulones in them, or the alpha acids. I'm just going to call them alpha acids, and they create the bitterness in beer. The only way you can get the alpha acids, they're insoluble, they're an oil, so they're insoluble in water. The only way you can get them into beer is to boil them, and then they isomerize. And so they're called iso-alpha acids. And that's what's dissolved into solution, and that's what creates bitterness in beers. And in fact, when we get our hops, this is a picture of a box of hops, very clearly labeled on the hops are the alpha acids in the hops. So that's the important thing to the brewers, to know what the bittering potential of those hops are. And so here I have a couple, these are some kind of more of the popular hops. There are hundreds of varieties of hops. And these are the alpha acids here. So these lower ones, they're not used for bittering. They're used more for the aromatics later in the flavor, later in the beer. These hops, these high alpha hops, they were actually developed by the mega breweries, the big breweries back in the 60s and 70s to make it so they don't have to use very many hops. They wanted as much alpha acids in a hop as possible, so they wouldn't have to buy as many hops to bitter Coors, which isn't very bitter, since you don't need very many. So that's the whole point. I just want to make the point that to get the bittering elements out of the hop, they have to be boiled. So they identified these humulones, these isoacids, as being what bitters beer. And that's the bittering agent for beer. So now we can finally get, I don't know how long we've been into this, but I can finally tell you what an IBU is. An IBU is 1 milligram of iso-alpha acids dissolved into 1 liter of beer. That's all it is. So a 50 IBU beer has 50 milligrams of iso-acids dissolved into 1 liter. It's that simple. That's all it is. The higher the number, the more that's dissolved in there. Does that make sense so far? Yeah. You know, if I am going too fast, or if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. Because this, yeah. Oh wow.
Doesn't the amount, the percentage of acid differ from year to year?
Yes, so that's why they are prominently labeled on here. This is the year crop here, and the alpha acids, they change every year, and so recipes will adapt to that. Exactly. That's why we do that. And did you have a question?
Yeah, so is it the direct conversion? You boil it and you get the alpha acids out of it? Or
No, that's what we're getting to next, is how do we come by the IBU, the number, the number. And so there are two ways to do this. There's the right way, and then there's the way everybody else does it. The right way is taking it to a lab, and it costs $30. You take your beer to the lab, and they run it. What they do is they'll take a sample of the beer. So I got to make sure I get this right. They add a little solvent. The solvent will extract those isoacids from the beer. They run it through a centrifuge, separate that, then take what they've separated there and put it into a spectrophotometer to measure so they can measure the wavelengths to it. And what they've done is they've identified this flavor compound as 275 nanometers, a light wave. And so they run light through it and then count, how much is reflecting that back. And there's a little multiplication they do there. But otherwise, it's a straight up number they read off of this very fancy looking device. And that's all it is. The way that most people come by this, though, is what I call the back of the napkin method. And that's this, which is kind of goofy. So you're taking the weight of the hops, multiplying that by the alpha acids in the hops, multiplying that by some sort, there's dozens of these formulas out there. You multiply that by some sort of variable that gives you a number for the time that it was actually boiled. Divide the whole thing by the volume of the hops, and there should be a fluid element in here. I would not use this. In fact, the best way to do it, you can Google IBU calculator, and there's dozens of them up there on homebrew forums and homebrew pages and all that kind of stuff. And all they do is you enter the alpha acids and the amounts you're using and how much fluid you're making, 5 gallons, 10 gallons, whatever, and it'll give you the IBUs. Well, the problem with this, it's okay for getting a general idea, but there's a lot, it doesn't actually measure what's in the beer. This is more of a potential than it is a actual. So you lose IBUs in the yeast. The yeast will absorb some of the IBUs. The effervescence, while it's fermenting, will scrub some of the CO2 will scrub some of the IBUs out, and none of that's accounted for in most of these formulas. But this is really how most people come up with their IBUs. And I asked at the bar tonight, they had a beer and they had 100 IBUs, and I asked him, I said, so do they send this to a lab? And he's like, I don't know, man, I don't know. Which I think is pretty common too. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I can understand why home brewers are using this formula, but in commercial, as a brew pub, can you do this? As opposed to sending it to a lab?
I will guarantee that most of the things that you go to 15 brew pubs in this neighborhood and read all the IBUs, and I would guess that, Deschutes, they have a lab. Widmer's got a lab. I'm sure Bridgeport has a lab. Anything smaller than that, they don't have their own labs, and they're not sending every beer off that they make. They're just doing some back of the napkin kind of thing and coming up with the IBUs.
What about for alcohol?
Alcohol is a very precise measurement that's very easy to make.
Yeah,
You
do they
have
send that to the government to measure, or do they do it themselves?
No, we do it ourselves, and it's very simple. It's really accurate. You start off with a certain amount of sugar, you end up, and there's a certain amount of sugar which is very accurately measured. The difference between it is all the sugar that's been eaten, and and that plugs right into how much alcohol is in the beer. So that's a solid number. So there's two issues that I want to address at this point of my beating down of IBUs. First of all, there's a maximum amount of isoacids that can be dissolved into solutions. So it's like if you took a glass of water and a 5-pound bag of sugar and tried to dissolve that all in there, you can't. There's a certain point where it will not dissolve anymore. It's the same thing with IBUs. The lab guy I talked to about this stuff, he said up at Hop Union, they tried to see how high they could get the IBUs, and they have a lot of hops to work with up there. And they got it to 138 IBUs, but he said at that point he could not tell within 20 points what it really was. And so he wasn't accurate at all. He said he thinks the limit is right around 120, 115 or 120 IBUs that you can actually dissolve into beer. So I haven't seen a lot of people advertising their beers at much over 100 IBUs, but it's very hard and tricky. If you study your chemistry, it's very tricky as you get closer and closer to that threshold to get any more into it. You're wondering why I've got Miley Cyrus up here. I wondered that too when I first saw this slide. But the second I asked my guy, I need a picture of a tongue, and that's all I could come up with. The other threshold here, there is a threshold to your palate, and your palate can only sense. They're saying that most of the research I've read is that the human tongue doesn't sense anything over 70 IBUs. So if you were to drink a 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, 95 and sample all that out, your tongue could not, you'd probably be thrashed by the end of that. But you couldn't tell the difference between any of those things. So there's two things right there. But that's not really why let's not look at her anymore. But in general, as far as the lab work goes, it's a sound idea that that's actually something that can be measured that we could talk about. So what is my problem with this? All right, so again, I'm talking about IBUs not from a lab. I'm not talking about IBUs from a hop grower who's trying to be consistent in what kind of hops he's growing. I'm talking about any of us going to a bar and seeing this number up on a board, prominently displayed next to all this other information, theoretically meaning something to us. And I think it fails. I believe it's inaccurate. I believe it's incomplete, irrelevant, and finally inelegant. And then that'll thing. So inaccurate. So I talked about how the numbers can be fudged to begin with. But this is a great example right here of why it's actually inaccurate. So now that we're educated as much as we are here, we're going to guess. So this is our Sunrise Oatmeal Pale Ale, which I'm enjoying right here, and a Vortex IPA. And we're going to use an imaginary bar because we don't publish our IBUs for anything. But in this imaginary bar, you'd see Sunrise Oatmeal Pale Ale, 5.2% alcohol, 45 IBUs. We did that on the back of a napkin. And there you got Vortex IPA, 7.2% alcohol, 93 IBUs. And you're thinking, I want all the hop bitterness I can get in this beer that I'm going to buy. I'm getting the Vortex. It's got 93 IBUs. But I don't know if anyone out here is drinking a Vortex, but if you've got a Vortex right here, if you sample these two beers side by side, this is by far more bitter because it doesn't have the malt body that the Vortex has. The Vortex is a very well-balanced beer. It's got a great malt body to back up all these hops we put in there, so you get a lot of flavor and a lot of aroma in there, and some bitterness to balance out that sweet malt. We don't even try to balance this beer. This beer is intended to be mouth-puckeringly bitter and lighter in body, so you can have 3 or 4 of them. And this is actually this is the go-to beer for most of our staff, is the OPA. And so it's inaccurate. If the guy is thinking he's getting the most bitter beer he can get and by ordering the highest number, it's not working at that level right there. It's an incomplete way of describing beer because all it's measuring is one very narrow thing about hops. It's only measuring its bitterness. The hops have a whole nother spectrum of flavor that's much wider than its actual bitterness. And then beyond that, a huge spectrum of aroma that you can describe, that number doesn't do anything for. It's also not the only way you get bitterness in beer. Yeast can create bitterness in beer, and that is not measured by an IBU number. And if you're drinking a stout or a porter, those roasted dark black barley malts add a lot of bitterness to beer that does not get accounted for in any sort of IBU. That's just off the radar. I believe the number is totally irrelevant. So here are some beers that maybe it's relevant to talk about. Your light lagers, I don't know, 12 IBUs, that's nothing. So why even talking about it? But you see, barley wines are incredibly sweet, and most of these double and triple IPAs are pretty sweet too. You get IPAs and pale ales are pretty bitter. Then, like I say, our oatmeal pale ale is right in here, and it's more bitter than anything you'll find on this end. But then there's beers like fruit beers, wheat beers, Hefeweizens, Wits, Bocks, stouts that have nothing to do with hops. There's this we've been stuck on hops for a while. And as a brewer, if you put IPA, that's what people want. That's why we're making so many. People aren't buying so many IPAs and pale ales because they're so great. We're making so many because that's what people want. That's how I kind of see it. I would love for, in the next couple of years, people to get tuned into like super subtle flavors in beer, or the malt characters to beer, box, big malt bombs, and just something different. But right now we're in IPAs, and I got to make a living, so we make a bunch of them. Finally, and this is really my point, I dwelled on this stuff for a long time about the inaccuracies and how it doesn't really matter. But in the end, I just think it's really inelegant. Beer has evolved a long ways in the 20 years I've been involved with it. And we should be able to talk about our beer intelligently and in a way, and this is my example here, why it's completely inelegant. And it's sort of my argument of the quantitative versus qualitative analysis of things. So this is a color wheel. And these are SRMs, standard research method, and these are the same thing these same breweries do that use the labs, is they put a number on the color of the beer. So light American lagers, a 1 or 2, a Hefeweizen might be a 4, an amber a 12, your IPAs might be 16 or 17. Have you ever seen anybody describe the color of their beer by saying, you're drinking a 14? It's crazy to think someone would try to indicate what a beer looked like by giving someone a number. Why do we think that the flavor of a beer is, you can tell them something with a number? And that's what I don't like about it. I just did a little, I went on the website, a couple of hop purveyors, and came up with some of the words that they use to describe their hops. And these aren't numbers, these are words. So flowery, floral, citrus, spicy, grapefruit, apple, piney, herbal, wood, fruit, earthy, grassy, cedar, tropical, lemon, tangerine, blackberries, resin, black currant, pear, peach, apricot, passion fruit. I've got a slide for this. Gooseberry, pineapple. And then you've got all sorts of modifiers. You can say soft, sharp, pungent, intense, subtle, on and on and on. And I really believe that in 2 or 3 or 4 words, you could really describe what a beer is like and not rely on a crutch like an IBU that often misleads people. So my solution here to this is to use language. It's like your mom used to tell you, or maybe you tell your kids, use your words. We could take some tips from the wine world where I don't think we need to be pretentious. I don't think we need to get as off the charts as they are sometimes, but you can use 3 or 4 words to describe what the hops are, what the flavor that you're intending to people to taste in your beer, and what people can expect to get in their beer, and start educating people that are drinking beer to ask for their beer by what they want to drink rather than this really vague number that means anything. I don't think you have to be intimidating about it. I've gone through my stages of, one of those bartenders that's just a jerk and makes you feel like an idiot because you ask for your beer on IBUs. People don't have to do that. I don't know how many people here work at bars and stuff or have influence on this, but I wouldn't do that. I've learned that's really a bad approach, that being snotty about it doesn't help. But it is a great, when someone asks you about IBUs, get them their beer. You can kind of find out what they want. Get them their beer and then kind of work with them and find out why do they talk about IBUs and what are they expecting in an IBU, and try to educate them about how it's not really helping them at all to think about beer like that. I don't know if I have anything else. Oh wait, I made him do a word cloud of beer describers. So that's all I've got. So I don't know if there are any questions. I would happily address them.
Originally, hops must have been a plant in the wild. Are there wild hops?
Absolutely.
What's it look like?
They look just like normal hops. They don't tend to grow on the big poles and stuff. But there was a place when I lived in Colorado where they had wild hops growing up one of the canyons out of Boulder, and people would go up there every year and try to get as many as they could for their home brews. It was just a wild hop vine, and nobody knew what it was.
In the industry, what's double IPA? I mean, so what's IPA and double IPA?
Okay, so an IPA is an India Pale Ale that they started making those in England, and they were shipped to India. And the idea was they were higher in alcohol and used a lot of hops in them. They were mostly unpalatable at the time. In fact, they would find our idea of an IPA to be completely unpalatable. The way we've gone off on a tangent with hops right now is unprecedented in beer making history. Nobody has ever used this many hops in anything. So a double IPA then, so if an IPA is 6 to 7%, then a double IPA is maybe 7 to 9%, and then more hops. It's vague. There's no specific way to talk about it. Yes?
Why did they make them that way? Was it for shipping?
Yeah, so the reason they did that was because most of the beers that they were enjoying, they had a huge expat community of Britons living in India, governing their colony there. So they're shipping this around the Horn, and the temperature would change all the way through. So it starts out pretty cool, goes through the tropics, it gets hot, gets cool again, back. So it's really bad for beer to be shaking around and changing temperature like that for 6 months or 4 months, how long it took them to get it there. But they found that the more hops and the higher alcohol they were, the better it preserved the beer. And it would get there and they could actually drink it.
So this is one thing. I end up like getting a headache and kind of like wanting to fall asleep or go home immediately when I drink some beers. It's kind of a weird thing. I love beer, a lot of beer, but I end up finding that I'm like, I'll take a Heineken or a Beck's because I can never figure out like ahead of time what kind of beer is not going to do that to me. You know what I mean? And I love it when I do find one. I'm like, oh, this is amazing. It's great. It's a local microbrewer. I love it. Da, da, da. But I can never like feel it. I'm always like, I don't know. So I'll take a Beck's, and then I'm like the lame dude who's drinking the Beck's. It's awesome. And I'm like, what is that? Do you know? Like,
Hops are a sedative.
okay.
So if you're drinking double IPAs all night that are 9%.
But I thought maybe it's like the yeast.
But another thing that I found that I get headaches from, and this is getting a little bit off topic, which I'm fine to do, so I can talk beer all night long, is some breweries have this thing where they don't let their beer ferment out all the way. They want their beer to end at a certain point, and there's a couple ways to do that. The way you mash your beer and brew it will bring it down to a certain sugar level in the fermentation, or you can decide just to cool the beer off. And I think what that's doing is leaving residual sugars in the beer that when you drink those will start to give you a headache, and especially really bad hangovers. I knew places, people don't do that much anymore, but 20 years ago there were breweries that I didn't drink their beer because I knew that's how they made it, and I'd drink 2 of them and I'd have a terrible headache the next day. Yes?
Is it fair to surmise that from what you're telling us that when you're designing a beer, you pick the hops based on the flavor profiles that you're going for more than like, okay, we want it to be this bitter, that bitter, that you're going like, we want these notes or those flavors into the beer?
And that all comes after the bitterness. So we add hops throughout the boil. The very first hops you add, so you boil for about 80 minutes. The very first hops you add are the hops that are going to add bitterness to that beer. And that's a really easy thing. And so, like this beer, I think it gets like a half a pound of hops. There's hardly any hops in a batch of this at the very beginning. The vast majority, and this is kind of ironic to me, the vast majority of hops these days going into pale ales and IPAs are going in post-fermentation. They're going into, so they're not adding any bitterness to the beer at all. They're all for aroma and flavor. Which you lose. So the way it works is when you put those first hops in and you boil it for an hour and a half, you lose all the aroma. That just goes up with the steam. Most of the flavor gets compromised too, so you're just extracting bitterness out of those. And then as you add hops further on to the boil, so they're boiling less and less time, you'll get more flavor out of it, and then the final hops you add are mostly for aroma, and then when you add hops after fermentation, that's all aroma. And so it's ironic that somebody would come into a bar these days and want the 93 IBUs, thinking he's getting as much hop character as he can get, when really it's it's not the IBUs that they're looking for right now. The popular IPAs are the ones that have great hop flavor, amazing aroma, but they don't have the tongue-tying bitterness. Nobody really wants that.
So are you using, I'm sorry, just as a follow-up to that, are you using different hops throughout your process? Would you use, without giving away some proprietary?
Yeah, no, none of us probably give away anything. It's almost irrelevant to me what hops we use in the first edition. It doesn't matter. Like I say, you're not getting any. All you're getting is straight up bitterness out of that, and that is a one-note band. That is just bitterness. It doesn't have any flavor to it. So we will use the hops we use to bitter with are generally the hops we have the most of. And then we can gauge how much we're going to add by that alpha acid percentage. So if it's a 6% alpha, we'll add a little more. If it's 15%, we add a little less. So, yes?
Does the beta acid content of the hops come into play at all?
It does, but that's mostly flavor. So it has nothing to do with IBUs, and it's not really a calculation that we use day to day.
In terms of flavor of beer, like after tasting many beers and having dedicated a palate so that you can create beers, what kind of flavors are exciting to you? What do you look for in terms of what you're drinking to taste?
Are you talking about me personally or in general?
Personally, yeah.
I like a beer to live up to how it's sold. I think that's why this bugs me, the IBU things. So if it's sold to me as a barrel-aged stout, it should have characters that I would expect in a barrel-aged stout. It should have some sort of boozy element from the barrel, and the stout should have this, what I interpret. So that's kind of how I do it. So I'm one of the guys at the bar that they never know what I'm going to order because I'm always trying something different. Whereas other people would drink the same beer every day. And so when I'm out drinking beers, like I had a couple today at a brew pub around the corner, and they both lived up to exactly how they were billed, and they were fine. They were great beers. That's kind of how I do it. Did I get out of answering your question?
I'm confused about what you said about the oatmeal IPA because I have it. It's great and it's bitter.
It's bitter.
But you said there's half a pound of hops in it, as if you don't add much bittering agent.
We don't, but there also is not a lot of body to it. It's very dry. It's not very alcoholic, and so they come through very cleanly.
It's great.
Thank you. Yes.
So when you send beer to a lab, does it account for the bitterness, the IBU count that you get? Does it account for the bitterness in the malts we use? Or does
Nope.
it not?
Nope. All they're measuring is the bitterness from the hops. That's the only thing that spectrophotometer is geared to do. It's not geared to measure bitterness from hop or from yeast or grain.
So I got here late, so I may have missed it. But how did IBUs start?
I don't know. Well, I know how it started. I know the root of it is industrial. I don't know where it crossed the line to be a marketing tool or a consumer index for how to taste beer. I don't know where that happened. I've tried to find the root of that, and I speculated earlier that it's like a homebrew forum or a mad, ingenious marketer. International bittering units. It's just a measurement. It is one compound, exactly. Yes?
You talked about the psychotropic ingredients and stuff before.
Oh, you want me to get back to my digression?
Before hops were so the one flavoring agent, do you guys brew anything like that, or do you have any interest in it, or maybe a protest against IBUs and say the no IBU beer?
Well, if they turn off all this stuff, I can tell you about things, but no. We use things, we use spruce buds. We make a spruce beer every year that absolutely has no hops in it. We use only spruce buds in it, which is a fabulous beer. We make a quick wit. Like our wheat beer, sometimes you throw just enough hops in, and you use a real low alpha. But another great thing about hops is they keep the boil in the kettle. They break up the surface tension on while it's boiling, and so you don't make a big mess. And so we'll throw a little bit of hops into like our wheat beer, our quick wit, and then we use lemongrass, and we don't use any psychotropic herbs. We don't or anything like that, but we use lemongrass and elderflower are in that beer. We love playing with herbs, and there's a book I highly recommend. It's a guy named Stephen Buhner. It's been out for almost 20 years now, and it's called Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers. And it sounds kind of cheesy, but it has this remarkable history of all these different ingredients in beers. It's a really amazing book. Yes?
So I think one of the reasons people get attached to the idea of an IBU is that it gives you some kind of handle on what you're going to be drinking. And the problem I know I have with wine description is that it is so subjective that I almost don't find it useful a lot of times. Maybe it's a matter of not having developed palate, but I'm going to go ahead and say most drinkers of most things don't have a super professional developed palate. So how do you argue that using
I would
words
say that
breaks
beer
the-
is subjective. And so you need to use subjective language to describe it. The number isn't getting it done. Trying to quantify something that is inherently unquantifiable you can't quantify a flavor. And that's what they're.
Especially because palates we taste things differently.
They're subjective. And like I said, I don't think we need to get as snotty as some wine descriptions have gotten. Sorry, but they can be intimidating. I agree, but I don't think it has to be that complicated. I think there's a great basket of words and language that are all about hops that will describe that. So you don't use a number to describe if you have a malt forward beer about how roasty or toasty or bread-like that is. There's no number to put on that.
Do you think there's specific categories that people should use to describe the palate of beer?
Yeah, I think beer styles work very well that way. So if you're saying you're making an IPA, that really narrows down what you're looking for right there.
Do your beers only come in 16-ounce cans? And if so, what led you to that decision?
Let me answer the second question first. We did a marketing study. We set these 5 people down, and we offered them the choice of a 12-ounce can and a 16-ounce can of beer. And every single person wanted a 16-ounce can. So we went with it. But no, we serve our Quick Wit and our Optimist IPA in 12-ounce cans because for some reason people like to drink beers in 6s. They freak out on 4s. I don't know. Did I answer that? Yeah.
You know, back in the old days, the big tall cans were the guys that used to drink on the way home in the paper bag while they were driving home from work. The old small liquor guys. The old hardcore alcoholics.
I'm standing right here. Yes, you.
Can you talk about how the hop farmers determine the flavors that they find in their hops? Is it just through brewing, or is there another way to do it?
It's a whole horticultural science that I am not, I could stand up here and pretend, but I think that might be another time. But it's remarkable, and I would compare it. So there are all sorts of these hop varieties. So the big hot version of hops right now are mosaic hops. Everyone loves mosaic hops. And it's like purple kush, I tell you. It's like the more you give people the money and permission to experiment and develop these offshoots and go crazy with different inbred varieties of stuff, they come up with there'll be blueberry hops, there'll be, I guess it's kind of the nature of the beast where hops are right now. And so they come up with these things, and then they'll experiment with them and let a couple of breweries trial run them. And there's this whole program at Oregon State where they develop hops. They try to develop them. In the past, their big goals were develop them for like mildew resistance and mite resistance. But now they're trying to find all these aromatics, because that's what everybody wants, was these fun aromatics out of hops.
So they would do a brew experiment with them too?
They make teas. They don't even bother with the beer. They just make teas out of them.
How long do we have to wait for you to open a brew pub in Portland?
When I can walk to work in Portland from my house in Astoria. Thank you, though. That's flattering. I appreciate that.
I was just wondering if you guys grow your own yeast strain, and if so, like, are you able to take all the proper measurements of that in particular?
Yeast? We're talking yeast now?
Yeah.
We use a yeast strain that we get from a company called Y Yeast up in Mount Hood, Oregon, on the north side of Mount Hood. And it's not a proprietary thing. It's ESB. It's got a number to something. And we do have a lab, though, where we measure the viability of those yeast cells, and we stay on top of how healthy they are. Who was next? I don't know. Is that it? Oh.
So, is there a movement against IBUs? Are there any other?
It's a one-man movement.
Beginning of the movement.
I've been
There's no other
anti-IBUs
dissenting
forever, and
opinion.
I just get more wound up about it the more I study it. You know, like I was ignorant about. Okay, so I proposed this talk that the Craft Brewers Conference, they have it every year. It's organized by the Brewers Association, and it's coming back to Portland. It hasn't been in Portland in like 10 years, and it's coming back to Portland this spring in April. And there's going to be 5,000, 8,000 brewers from across the country here in Portland in April. It's going to be kind of nutty. I wouldn't go out. But I proposed to do this talk there, and I've done other things with them. I mean, I knew all these guys when I lived in Boulder, and I used to volunteer. When I left Boulder, I volunteered for a few years to help set up jockey boxes and stuff at their festival, at their conference, so I could get a free ticket to get in and stuff like that. And I knew all these guys, and they know my name, and they still rejected this idea. And I think I hadn't developed maybe it well enough, but also there is a lot of marketers out there that don't want to hear anything about this. This is how they talk about their beer. This is how they've been trained to talk about their beer. This is how they sell their beer. This is how they've trained the people drinking their beer to think about their beer. So it's not really information that they're really tuned into. But I promise I got rejected for the talk, but I'm taking my little soapbox. It'll actually be a crate, a little food crate, and I am literally going to set it up at the convention center and stand there and start ranting. See what happens.
Do it.
Are you going to start implementing some of the strategies on Fort George beers, like put it on the can or?
Absolutely. We don't use it.
So you don't have IBUs, right?
We have
you don't have
the Vortex IPA. I think our can says 93 IBUs, and that is something. I don't really want to get into the background of that, but it's very expensive to change that sometimes. And when we first did that, we did that, and it wouldn't happen again. And it's due for an update, and it won't be on future versions. Don't read your can.
97.
Whatever.
So high.
Yes.
I'm curious where you see the palate of your beer consumers, the person, people who are drinking your beer. Where do you see that evolving? You have a great stout festival, obviously, but
yes,
there are a lot of.
Thank you. I think I can't see any end to the IPA IPA era right now, but I know that anytime we make a Scotch ale or a Bock, they sell like crazy. They sell really well. We just did a beer with Josh here, Plasm, our farmhouse ale, and it is selling really well. Not as fast as an IPA. I don't know who picked the. Most people probably picked an IPA tonight to drink. It's just what people want. A stout, very good. That's what people like. And so you could make a nice malty red ale, but if you want to sell it, I recommend putting the letters IPA on it.
I think Northwest IPA or Northwest Red Ale is pretty much a really hoppy red ale.
Yes, it is.
So is your most popular beer at Fort George or IPA? Like hot cellar?
At Fort George, we have probably 4 or 5 beers. 2 or 3 of those would probably be hop-forward beers that are the most popular. The beer that we send the most out to the world is definitely the Vortex IPA.
So why do you think IPA and Sun Pale Ales are so popular?
I don't know. I guess people have a taste for them right now. You know, the whole theory about, this is really going off on a tangent, but how cats have that kind of thing that get into your brain and make you like the smell of cat pee, that parasite. Maybe there's something in hops that addict people to it or something. I don't know. I complain about it, and the first thing I order when I go to a new brew pub is their IPA or their pale ale. And it's not because of the IBUs. I'm not complaining about IPAs. I'm complaining about IBUs. You guys share.
All right. Have you talked at all to Dave Sullivan, who does the 33 books? He developed his own system. He took it from a bunch of places and sort of quantified it into his own system for charting the flavor of beer and then wine and then chocolate and cheese.
I am not familiar with that.
It's a flavor wheel, and it uses words like you've used to describe. And he did that because he was going to beer festivals, and he'd be tasting all these different beers, and
after a while, and a couple of beers, he had hard times remembering what the beers tasted like after the next day. So he made this little like kind of chart. But anyways, you should check it out.
Yeah, I will. No, that would be super helpful to have. I just think that's what we need to do is develop better language for how to describe beer.
I was just going to say more as a comment. I mean, I hear some of the things you're saying about, you know, the education to the consumer, and maybe the marketers have some influence there. And I wonder, you know, first of all, do you find that there's a more educated consumer here in the Northwest, you know, in crazy beer world where we're very into craft beer? I mean, I know that the hop thing is more huge here because hops are from here, or probably that's part of it. You know, you go to the East Coast and the hoppiest beer is like, yeah, that's weak sauce, you know. But I think educating them about the other nuances of beer gives you a better consumer. Because like what you said about the vortex, all right, not consumer, drinker of beer. Fair enough. What you said about the vortex, I'm not an IPA fan generally. That's one of the few I actually like. And what you said about the malt profile being richer, I'm like, oh, that makes sense because I like stouts. My palate likes sweeter things. And so, you know, with that balance, like I didn't even like IPAs at all until they started coming out with the black or the Cascadian dark IPAs. And it was like, oh, well, at least it's more balanced because there's more malt. And so now I've gotten to where I can kind of tolerate the IPAs, but, you know, given the choice, I'll look at the darkest thing on the menu. And then maybe I'll look at the IBUs if there's 2 stouts, and I'll pick the one with less, you know, depending on the style. So it's some of that, I don't know, I'm going to shut up because I'm just rambling, but what do you think about in terms of getting your
I think that people in the Northwest are a little caught up in the fact that they think they own the craft beer world. I mean, I go back to Colorado now, and man, they have just as many breweries as Oregon does there, and they've been doing it for years, and they know what they're doing. California, I mean, the real West Coast IPA wasn't developed in the Northwest. It was developed in San Diego. That's where that came from. Arizona has some great breweries. I haven't been a whole lot further east than that as far as being able to explore a whole lot of beer, but I think that the Northwest is kind of, I don't know, full of itself a little about, I mean, but it is. The culture here is 15, 20 years ahead of a lot of places. I mean, I don't doubt that you'll go into a dive bar here and have way more variety of beer than you would have in a dive bar in Detroit, probably. But I can't say, but I'm guessing that's the case. See, I'm done rambling too.
Can you tell us a little about your hat?
Good question.
Why is it hams?
Oh, it's the hams hat. Okay, so I'll tell you. I had to take some beer back to the Coors distributorship in Oregon City last fall. Well, I had to go pick up beers there. And they had these hams hats for $5, and they had t-shirts for $5. And so I bought one of each, and I got back and I said, you idiot. So when I took the keg back, I bought all of their hats and all of their t-shirts. I'm a big hams fan. I grew up in Oregon, man. I drank hams when I was a kid. I love the bear. There's a place in my life for a light American lager to mow the lawn with. That's great stuff. Yes.
So that was actually my question, and I kind of scared myself out of it. But do you have like a cheap, shitty beer that you like more than others? I'm guessing it's hams.
It's hams.
It's hams.
I do not. I had this guy say, "Oh, wow, that's really nice and ironic." This is not ironic. Yes.
What's your favorite Oregon brewery besides Fort George?
That's kind of put me on the spot, isn't it?
Maybe just right now. Maybe not all time, but just.
Who do I like right now? I don't know. I don't know. There's too many, and I like the one I'm at. How's that? Does that work? Whichever one I'm at the time. You know, Brewing in Astoria is great. They're doing a great job over there. They're making great beers, and I appreciate that spot. And I can get to, to like something, you got to be able to access it, right? It's closer to my house than my work. Anything else? We've done my close and my bars. Okay.
So are hops like spices in the pricing
Exactly.
structure? But in the pricing structure
Oh.
too, are they very expensive? I mean, some
$12 a pound?
compared to the spices.
Unless someone's gouging you, which has happened, but that's another story. Yeah, you know, great. The good hops right now are about $12 a pound, but you can get them for $6 a pound too. $12 a pound.
Is that fresh, or is that like pelletized?
Those are pelletized, but they'd be the same fresh.
Okay.
Going back a couple of years ago, I remember one, a hop shortage, and two, Oregon taxes changing to come down or to get more from the craft brewing industry. Was that true? Was there a huge increase in price? Am I
No.
misinformed?
So those bills never went through.
Okay.
They try every year, every 2 years to raise the excise tax on hops or on beer, and that has not happened yet. It's $2.70 a barrel still in Oregon, and the hop shortage was, I believe, am I still on tape? I have my conspiracy theories about that too. I'll just leave it at that.
Didn't happen as okay.
Just like the current cash short.
There you go.
How about organic beer? Do you guys do organic and it's not labeled, or can't do it, or?
So the way we do organic at Fort George is we try to take and use the biggest effect we can to be organic. We are not certified organic. We use certified organic base malt in all of our beers, which is 30-40% more expensive than standard malt. We don't really advertise that. In the restaurant, we use all organic potatoes for our French fries, which is the vast, I mean, we use hundreds and hundreds of pounds of potatoes, and that's like the thing we send out the most of. And we use organic greens. But we're not really interested in like being purebred organic about anything. It really, and on the beer side, which I'm more familiar with, it really limits your choices, and especially with hops. And for a while, they didn't count the hops because it was by weight, and hops don't add hardly any weight to a beer. So, but they've eliminated that loophole, and so now to be 100% organic, you need to use organic hops, and there's still not very many varieties. It's hard enough to get hops.
How about gluten-free?
Gluten-free? Yeah, we don't do gluten-free either. And for, you know, maybe a lot of people think it's excuses, but I think if you're gonna be gluten-free, you almost have to be 100% gluten-free, because we are a malt factory. We've got malt flying all over the place, and to isolate the extracts and stuff in the beer in such a way as to guarantee that it's completely gluten-free is really unrealistic. And what we'd have to bring in tubs of extract of some whatever kind of sugar you're getting. And I've tried a lot of gluten-free beers. I've never really had one that I thought was great. I just still haven't. There's some that are passable. There's some that I would drink on a desert island with no other alternative. But that's about as close as I've gotten. So we don't do. Yeah, in our pizza place, we do these gluten-free pizzas now. After much, I complained about it, but we just have so many requests. People want gluten-free. They'll sit there, order a gluten-free pizza, and drink a stout. But so we've got some gluten. We order in these frozen crusts, but they're going into a pizza oven that these guys are throwing dough around and throwing other pies into. I don't know what people are thinking. So if I was a celiac, I would not eat in a restaurant unless it was gluten-free all the way through, rather than just having gluten-free buns for this or that. No questions? Oh.
Have you ever done foray into any other kind of like craft anything as far as food consumption, like coffee or wine or distilling or anything? Have you personally ever been interested in doing anything like that?
We talked about distilling for a while, but the numbers weren't working out. We're better at making beer than distilling. We've never made cider. You need a wine license to make cider, and we actually have a wine license, but we don't really want to make cider. We're just kind of good at what we do. And we stopped making that. Yeah. Yes?
So IPAs are here to stay, but
Yeah.
if you think, what do you think, if anything, would replace hops in the brewing process?
I love spruce buds. I think they're amazing. That's my number one that we do every. Those spruce buds come out at this year they might come out a whole lot earlier because everything's whacked out. We didn't have our winter on the coast. I don't know what you guys did here, but so everything's blooming earlier. But generally they come out the last week of April, first week of May. We go out and pick about 500-600 pounds of spruce buds on this guy's property across the river in Washington, and bring them back and make a big batch of beer out of them. And it makes fabulous beer. It's great stuff. Super refreshing.
And that just replaces the hops?
Yep, just use them just like hops.
We can only drink it in the spring.
Right, it's usually gone by the 4th of July.
I'll look forward to it.
Yeah.
Is there a different flavor profile for fresh hops versus dry hops?
You're talking fresh hops like right off the vine into the kettle
I
kind of
guess so.
stuff?
Like fresh hop season comes around here, the beers.
I could give another talk on that. Fresh hops are a big thing these days, and so wet hop, fresh hop, basically the idea is you're not drying and using the hops out of a bale, or you're not pelletizing them. You're getting them, and within 24 hours they're going into your beer. And there's a huge program where they fleece all the brewers. Did I say that out loud? To get all these fresh hops to them every year, and everyone wants these fresh hop beers, and we make 5 or 6 different kinds of it. And my favorite one that we do make that I love is called Co-Operative, and basically we send out a message to all our locals and say, if you've got hops growing on your back fence or your barn or your house, bring them in on this day and we're going to make a beer with them. And that's a lot of fun to do because people get to sit out on the deck and pick them and play with them and get all resiny, and that's really fun. But in general, I don't think fresh hops make a better beer. I don't think they add to a beer. They have a unique flavor that I don't think you would mistake as better. In fact, we add a whole bunch of pellets to the dry hopping to make it taste great. Sorry. Oh, but I wrote fresh hop beers for you. Will you take me off this before I completely put myself out of business? Thank you. Thank you. I can go now, huh?
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Perjure yourself too much.
Yeah, I did.
I did. We return March 24th with Michael Madigan from Kitchen Crew and Bowery Bagels with his talk, Remastering the Classics, Getting Back in Touch with Our Food. Recent years have seen a backlash to the tyranny of huge agribusiness, mass-produced foods, and better nutrition through chemistry. Oregon is leading the country in managing a regional food shed from end to end. Production of high-quality ingredients, produce, and proteins while caring for the land and water, creative use of product to make delicious food, and a motivated and engaged consumer base. Some of the most exciting food in the country is being grown and produced in Oregon right now. We will explore this movement and learn about how creative farmers, cooks, and other industry players are revitalizing food culture in Oregon for all our benefit. An entrepreneur and accomplished businessman, Michael Madigan is the brains behind Kitchen Crew and the owner at both Bowery Bagels and Remedy Wine Bar. New York City native, Michael moved to Portland in 1987 with a love of food and wine and a passion for knowledge. Michael opened Portland's Kitchen Crew, a shared use community kitchen and culinary incubator in March 2011. So it should be great. Let's have another round of applause for that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
That was awesome.
Oh, good.
It was great. It was really good.
Oh, good.
I grabbed one of Dave's books. We actually sell them here, the beer books.